So the underlying reason is that the core focus of the Danish response is to ensure that hospitals are not being overwhelmed. And while we are having very, very high case counts, they are not putting pressure on hospitals to the same extent. And in order to have restrictions here in Denmark, it is legally required that you can that COVID is what you can call a critical threat towards the critical functions of society, and that is very hard to justify at the moment.
Yeah. So how do you weigh up what is a threat to society, what is societal threat, and at what point you loosen the reins on that?
It is essentially a political decision because it involves multiple trade-offs. So there is, of course, the question about the epidemic situation, but you need to trade off that against what are the impact on the economy, what is the impact of restrictions on the well-being of people, and also the fact that when you have restrictions, you are putting basic democratic rights on hold. So even though you could say that it would be nice from the perspective of epidemic control to just wait a little bit longer, then waiting is not for free either. So it does come with costs.
Yeah. So when you do the research, because of course you've gone through different phases over this pandemic, and at times there have been restrictions despite public opinion. So what does your research tell you about where public opinion sits at the moment?
So right now, there is a majority who are clearly in favor of lifting the restrictions. So this is not met with a public backlash at all, and we can see that the people's sense of coronavirus being a societal threat have been dropping sharply over the last weeks. And I think it's important to say here that this is not an indication that Danes in general are opposed to restrictions. They were very supportive of putting those restrictions into place in December, but the sense is simply that they are no longer needed. So this does not reflect a general opposition towards restrictions. It reflects an assessment of the current situation that they are no longer needed.
It is also not necessarily the fact that Danes don't care about other Danes and whether they get ill or die. I mean, there are other drivers like the high vaccination rate.
Yes, for sure. So that's very important to take into account. So 81% of all Danes are vaccinated with 2 shots, and 61% of all Danes have received a booster vaccine as well. So there's very high vaccine uptake. And also when we look at the opinion research that we're doing right now, then even when people are supporting the lifting of restrictions, it's not because they don't care about COVID. It's not because they don't care about the vulnerable. In fact, 80% of the population says they are motivated to do what they can in order to help the vulnerable take precautions. So in that sense, it is less a matter of whether you sort of see coronavirus as something that doesn't matter for anyone, and more a sense that we can handle this as individuals. And in fact, even the elderly, among the elderly, there is also a clear majority in favor of lifting the restrictions because they feel they know how to deal with the risk themselves.
And so that's a really critical point. Even though you're dropping a lot of the restrictions, in fact, all of the restrictions, is there still a lot of self-regulation among Danes?
Right now, there is. So we have dropped all restrictions one time before. That was in September. And there we could see a lot less focus on distancing, on hygiene and so forth. But we're seeing a lot of focus on that. So the fact that restrictions are being lifted does not mean that the epidemic is gone. People know that there is an epidemic and are still taking precautions.
Yeah. Why not keep minor restrictions like mask wearing in public and, it's not a big infringement on your personal liberty?
No, and I think in order to understand that, it's important to understand the whole legal situation in Denmark. And the legal situation is kind of black and white in the sense that you need to be able to say this is a critical threat to critical functions of society in order to have any restrictions at all. So you first need to make that assessment, and then you can say, okay, if that's the case, then we can begin to impose restrictions. But it's actually not possible within the framework of the Danish law regulating the epidemic response to say, well, we can just have a few pieces of restrictions here and there. It's either it's a critical threat and then you have restrictions, or it's not, and then you cannot have the restrictions.
Yeah, so it's been quite a delicate sort of balancing act for you in the position that you are advising the government. Omicron, of course, is highly virulent, but does seem to be overall less severe. Has that played a role in it as well?
That plays a huge role in it, because we can see as the Omicron wave took over from our Delta wave, then even though we have these very, very high case counts, then the number of people who are admitted to intensive care is dropping. So part of the reason why we are seeing less pressure on the hospitals is exactly because of the Omicron variant. And you can say that here Denmark has been in a fortunate situation in some sense, because Omicron was spreading a lot in Denmark early on, and we have very good sequencing capacity. So we have been able to get a pretty good sense of the impact of Omicron, and have pretty solid data suggesting that it is indeed milder.
So do you think now is the time where you are starting to really seriously live with COVID?
I think that's the general sense, that in the current situation now we are ready to live with COVID, but there is also a sense in the public, and that has also been communicated from the authorities, that you never know what will happen later on in this epidemic. So new variants may emerge. You don't know what exactly will happen when winter arrives here in Denmark again, and part of the reason why we're relaxing measures now is also to say that, okay, then we are ready if the threat reappears.
Fascinating. Michael, always lovely to get your perspective on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.